There are moments in war when sheer force seems unstoppable. Moments when the ground trembles beneath the weight of machines and the sky roars with blades. In Vietnam, that thunder often belonged to the Americans. Their gunships swept across treetops with the fury of a storm, hurling shockwaves that rattled the jungle canopy. Their artillery ships churned untouched forest into broken, cratered wasteland. Their elite soldiers, trained for everything from reconnaissance to counterinsurgency, moved with confidence earned from years of preparation. And yet, among all this overwhelming power, the Viet Cong whispered about one opponent with a fear unlike anything the Americans inspired. These weren't the men they expected. They weren't American at all. They were Australians, silent, precise, and unrelenting. The Viet Cong gave them a name spoken with caution: Hmong, the shadows of the wilderness, the unseen hunters who seemed to rise straight out of the undergrowth. In 1965, when Australia stepped into the war beside the United States, they didn't simply add more troops to the conflict. They brought with them a philosophy learned the hard way in the thick jungles of Malaya and the rugged terrain of Borneo. Their Special Air Service Regiment, barely 7 years old, operated under a belief that small teams could achieve what battalions could not. By moving where no one else dared, staying silent where others relied on noise, and striking in ways that left the enemy confused and terrified. Where American units built fire bases and hammered out landing zones, these Australians drifted into the deep green of Phuoc Tuy province as if the jungle itself had opened up to swallow them whole. In that tangled world where visibility shrank to arm's length and sound carried in strange currents, the rules of conventional warfare collapsed completely. The Viet Cong treated these forests as their home turf. They had fought through them since before most foreign troops even knew the region existed. They believed they understood every pathway, every streambed, every hollow tree that could hide a scout or shelter a rifleman. But they didn't understand the Australians. In teams of 4 or 6, the SAS slipped through vines and bamboo like creatures native to the shadows. They didn't make unnecessary sound. They didn't use radios unless absolutely essential. And unlike other forces, they weren't hunting territory, they were hunting people. They became part of the terrain, patient and merciless, content to wait for days or even weeks before striking. American Special Operations units had their own style, efficient and formidable in its own right. The Green Berets focused on training local forces to fight alongside them. Navy SEALs attacked with speed and crushing firepower. Long-range reconnaissance patrols moved in larger formations, depending on steady support from an enormous logistical machine. But the Australians operated as if they had separated themselves entirely from the rest of the war. Their movements resembled the rhythm of the forest, slow, methodical, deliberate. A misplaced twig or a glimmer of metal could betray everything, so they avoided mistakes entirely. By 1966, the Viet Cong themselves documented what they were facing. An intelligence summary captured in Ben Hoa province read like a warning carved into stone. It urged complete caution in the regions where Australian reconnaissance was reported. Their presence, the document stated, could not be detected by normal means. Their traps appeared without noise. Their ambushes ignited out of nowhere. Unlike American troops who often revealed themselves through radio chatter or the crunch of movement, the Australians simply melted into the environment. The Viet Cong report admitted something rare: fear. It noted that wherever the Australians patrolled, enemy losses increased dramatically, while no verified kills against Australian patrols could be confirmed. The recommendation was clear: avoid these units entirely, and if contact occurred, escape immediately. The document admitted that this wasn't fear of advanced technology or sheer numbers. It was fear of something that felt supernatural, a presence that seemed to materialize and vanish like spirits. By the final months of 1966, Viet Cong groups began reporting strange patterns. Patrols disappeared without gunfire. Hidden supply points were located and destroyed without a single sighting of who discovered them. Trails they believed were safe suddenly seemed watched, even though no eyes were visible. They knew the Australians were out there somewhere, but they could never truly grasp where. In February 1970, a 4-man team from 3 squadrons CSR prepared to enter one of the most dangerous regions around. Their task was to locate and observe a Viet Cong base believed to be operating near the Hat Ditch area. north of a village called Nui Dat. They did not rely on helicopters to drop them close. Instead, they trekked more than 30 kilometers through enemy territory in a journey that demanded constant focus and unbroken discipline. Their formation reflected years of practice. 4 men moving with gaps of several meters between them, each responsibility clear. The lead scout studied the ground like a living map. Disturbed leaves, unnatural pressures in the soil, tracks pressed into damp mud. Every sound, every hint of human movement was noticed and analyzed. They advanced for 6 hours, covering 9 kilometers. An ordinary infantry unit would have crossed that space in perhaps 2 hours. The SAS took 3 times as long because they examined everything, not as paranoia, but as survival. On the 3rd day, they settled into an observation post only a few hundred meters from the suspected Viet Cong camp. 2 men watched while the others rested. They rotated every few hours. No voices were spoken aloud. They communicated with hand signals and short glances. No cooking fires flickered. No cigarettes glowed in the dark. They ate cold rations and maintained complete discipline. For a single mistake could give up their position and doom the entire mission. For almost 2 days they watched. They counted fighters, studying their routines and identifying leaders by the way orders passed through the group. They marked defensive structures and documented supply storage. When night fell, they whispered a coded radio transmission lasting barely 4 minutes over 3 days. And then, at dawn, the sky erupted. Australian directed artillery rained down with precise fury. The barrage lasted only minutes, but the results were devastating. More than 30 confirmed enemy losses. By the time the dust settled, the SAS patrol was already miles away, moving toward their next assignment with the same quiet patience they'd brought into the field. The Viet Cong searched the tree line afterward, combing the jungle for any sign of who had watched them. They found no footprints, no empty cartridges, no disturbed soil. Nothing but the unsettling silence that followed the Australians like a signature. By April 1967, another patrol, this time 5 men from 2 Squadron, set up along Route 328, east of a region called Suyen Mak. Intelligence suggested that Viet Cong units were moving weapons from Cambodia along this route, feeding a network of fighters deeper in the south. The Australians planned a classic linear ambush, positioning themselves with claymore mines angled to maximize the killing area and overlapping lanes of fire covering every angle. Every man understood his role clearly, and once in position, they waited, and waited, and then waited still longer. 18 hours passed. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Ants crawled across their gear and onto their skin, biting without mercy. The Australian soldiers didn't react. They couldn't. Any movement might betray them. When dusk approached on the 2nd day, movement finally appeared along the trail. A dozen Viet Cong fighters walked into view, heavily armed with rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortar rounds. The Australians counted each step, letting the men drift deeper into the kill zone. Timing mattered more than anything. Strike too early and some would escape. Strike too late and the advantage vanished. The ambush commander breathed slowly, measuring the moment, letting the last fighters enter the zone. Then came the silent count. 3, 2, 1. What followed was 4 seconds of violence so fast and so intense that the Viet Cong barely understood they were under attack. The claymores erupted in a wall of deadly fragments. The Australians fired with precision, hitting every target they intended to. When the smoke drifted away, 12 enemy fighters were down. The Australians quickly gathered captured weapons, seized important documents revealing supply routes, and vanished into the jungle. The entire process, from the first shot to their complete withdrawal, took barely 6 minutes. To the Viet Cong units attempting to understand what had happened, the Australians might as well have been ghosts. The jungle swallowed their tracks, and their silence left nothing behind but the aftermath of their accuracy. Reinforcements from nearby Viet Cong units rushed toward the ambush site less than half an hour after the shooting had stopped, moving quickly along the narrow jungle trail with the belief that they would catch the attackers still escaping. But when they reached the scene, all they found were their fallen comrades and shattered supply crates scattered across the dirt. Not a single sign showed where the Australians had come from or where they had gone. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. A month later, when Australian forces captured an enemy field report dated May 1967, they found a grim description of what had happened. The document called the attackers the Australian Ghosts, describing how they struck the supply column along Route 328 with perfect precision, killed a dozen fighters, seized critical weapons, and vanished before anyone could react. The report admitted openly that no visual contact had been made, no sounds of departure or approach were heard, and morale had taken a severe blow. It even mentioned that their own troops had grown so shaken that many refused to walk the trails at night. As the months of 1977 unfolded, the Viet Cong's 274th Regiment began issuing internal directives specifically addressing the Australians. Again and again, their captured documents echoed the same descriptions: sudden appearance, lethal efficiency, and complete disappearance. These warnings weren't written out of bureaucratic obligation, they were written out of fear. Nearly 30 years later, a former Viet Cong platoon commander named Nguyen Van Than recounted his memories in a 1995 interview. He drew a clear distinction between the Australians and the Americans. He said the American approach was obvious, predictable, even loud. Helicopters always preceded their arrival, and artillery often followed. Large formations of soldiers moved with unmistakable noise. Even when American patrols were dangerous, they were rarely invisible. The Viet Cong could hear them approaching, anticipate their direction, and either prepare for battle or melt away before the clash. But the Australians, he said, were something entirely different. They navigated the forest with the same quiet patience the Viet Cong prided themselves on, yet they somehow surpassed even the most experienced guerrillas in their ability to stay hidden. Again and again, he described finding comrades dead in the jungle, with no one having seen or heard the Australians who killed them. He likened it to fighting specters, silhouettes that were never fully there, shapes whose presence was only revealed through the aftermath they left behind. This psychological pressure seeped deep into the Viet Cong ranks. Patrols became uncertain, movements slowed to a crawl. Fighters who once stepped confidently along familiar trails began checking every branch and shadow, convinced they were being watched even when the forest remained still. A captured command report from August 19th made the situation brutally clear. It declared that Australian reconnaissance teams posed the greatest threat of any foreign force operating in the region. Their abilities, the report emphasized, surpassed even elite American units. It explained that while American special forces often relied on overwhelming support, radio calls, aircraft, artillery, the Australians depended on stealth, patience, and minimal equipment. And somehow, even though the Viet Cong had mastered these skills through years of guerrilla warfare, the Australians had elevated them even further. The distinction was profound. American troops brought the energy of an industrialized military, the noise, the speed, the infrastructure, the predictable patterns. The Australians blended into the environment itself, shifting from place to place without trace, making their movements nearly impossible to predict. For an insurgent force that believed the jungle belonged to them, encountering an enemy that moved through it with greater finesse was a psychological wound deeper than any physical loss. By the late summer of 1967, the roles had begun to reverse. The hunters found themselves hunted. Rumors spread through Viet Cong camps that the Australians could see in the dark, that they floated through the trees, that they understood the forest better than the people who had fought in it their entire lives. These stories may have sounded like superstition, but they were rooted in the cold, methodical reality of SAS operations. That same month, another mission added fuel to the legend. The operation took place near the Long Hai Hills, a region controlled so firmly by the Viet Cong that even approaching its outskirts was considered a near-suicidal task. Beneath the dense vegetation lay layers of bunkers, tunnel networks, and fortified gun positions, with enough manpower to repel entire battalions. Australian leadership required fresh intelligence on the enemy's strength, layout, and daily patterns if they were to break into this stronghold. A 6-man patrol from 3 Squadron drew the assignment. Their insertion was quick, barely half a minute on the ground before the helicopter pulled away, leaving them alone in one of the most dangerous landscapes in the province. The patrol faded into the jungle almost instantly, beginning a slow, grueling approach toward the target area. It took 2 days to reach a position close enough to observe the main Viet Cong camp. The terrain tested them without mercy. Razor-sharp vines tore fabric and scraped skin. Slopes steep enough to slide forced the men to climb on their hands and knees, pulling themselves upward inch by inch. In the worst sections, they could advance no more than 50 meters in an hour. Yet they pressed on, never rushing, never making unnecessary noise. On the third day, they established an observation post perched high on a ridge about 400 meters from the heart of the enemy camp. The vantage point was perfect. Clear sightlines without exposing themselves, natural rock and foliage concealing their position. From there, they watched continuously for 3 days, studying everything the Viet Cong did. They counted more than 200 fighters moving through the site. 17 bunkers were cataloged. 3 tunnel entrances were identified. They tracked patrol schedules, defensive patterns, and the command chain visible through the way. Orders passed between officers. Every night, they transmitted only the most essential details through brief coded radio messages lasting a few minutes at most. They understood that extended communication could jeopardize the mission. Once the intelligence mission was complete, they began to withdraw. The return route mirrored the path they had used before, each step careful and unhurried. Viet Cong patrols passed dangerously close, sometimes within 100 meters, but failed to spot anything unusual. The Australians exfiltrated successfully without a single shot fired and without suffering a single casualty. 2 weeks later, Australian troops launched a coordinated assault on the Long Hai stronghold. They used the very routes the SAS teams had charted and exploited the vulnerabilities the patrol had uncovered. The attack succeeded with a precision that stunned the Viet Cong defenders. Later, when enemy records were seized, an astonishing revelation emerged. A Viet Cong after-action assessment, written during the same period as the SAS patrol, insisted that no foreign reconnaissance forces had entered their area. Their defensive lines were believed secure. Their perimeter patrols had detected nothing. They had no clue that 6 Australians had watched them for 3 days from only a few hundred meters away. That incident highlighted what truly set the SAS apart. It wasn't superior technology or advanced equipment. If anything, their gear was lighter and simpler than what American forces used. Their difference came from their philosophy and their training. While American special forces operated with generous support systems, ready at a moment's notice, the SAS trained to survive with as little as possible. Their patrols were intentionally small, their loads intentionally light, their expectations intentionally limited. They carried enough rations to last a week, a modest amount of ammunition, a single radio, basic medical gear, and water purification tools. Nothing more. American units often carried double the gear and moved in larger numbers. In heavy triple canopy jungle, this became a disadvantage. More men meant more footsteps, more sound, more heat signatures, more opportunities to be noticed. 4 or 6 highly skilled soldiers, by contrast, moved almost weightlessly through the forest, leaving barely any trace, and the SAS selection process demanded that every individual be exceptionally versatile. While American units divided responsibilities among specialists, one expert handling communications, another focusing on weapons, another trained in medical care, the Australians trained each man to do everything. Any member of the patrol could navigate complex terrain. Any man could operate the radio and call in artillery. Every soldier could stabilize a wounded comrade. Every soldier could assume command if needed. This redundancy gave the team the ability to keep functioning, even if things went horribly wrong. A lost radio operator wasn't a crisis, because everyone knew how to operate the radio. A wounded navigator wasn't the end of the mission, because everyone knew the route. This structure allowed the Australians to operate deep in enemy territory with confidence. It let them adapt instantly to unpredictable situations. It gave them a quiet, deadly efficiency that made their presence feel unreal to the Viet Cong who faced them. And it ultimately built the reputation that still lingers in military history. The reputation of ghosts drifting through a landscape that believed it belonged to someone else. The Viet Cong prided themselves on being masters of the ambush. They had shaped the very concept of modern guerrilla warfare long before most foreign soldiers even stepped foot in Southeast Asia. They had fought the French, driven away the Japanese, then battled the French again, learning from each conflict and sharpening their tactics over decades of relentless struggle. But when the Australians entered Vietnam, they didn't simply study these tactics, they absorbed them, refined them, and then elevated them to a level the Viet Cong had never confronted. Many SAS officers had already battled communist guerrillas in Malaya and Borneo, operating in thick, humid forests that mirrored the tangled chaos of Vietnam. Those years of hunting insurgents through dense jungles had built a deep understanding of how to move quietly, how to wait longer than the enemy, and how to use patience as a lethal weapon. They carried that knowledge with them when they arrived in Vietnam, where they quickly realized that brute strength meant little in a landscape where a single careless step could reveal everything. In this environment, time was more powerful than gunfire, silence more useful than speed, and intelligence far more valuable than aggression. American combat style revolved around locating the enemy, pinning them down, and destroying them with overwhelming force. The SAS lived by a different philosophy entirely. Discover the enemy first, study them completely, report everything accurately, and only strike when the advantage was so absolute that escape was impossible. To the Viet Cong, who were accustomed to fighting loud, predictable, heavily equipped opponents, the sudden appearance of an enemy they couldn't detect or anticipate felt like a blow straight to the mind. Across the years that followed, numerous Viet Cong veterans spoke about their encounters with the Australians, and their stories carried a recurring theme: fear, born not from defeat, but from uncertainty. One former intelligence officer named Viet Cong, interviewed in 1998, admitted that he could analyze American units with ease. He knew their tools, their strategies, and their usual weaknesses. He understood how their commanders thought and how their troops behaved. But the Australians defied all logic. He said they moved with a similar rhythm to the Viet Cong, but with a level of precision and discipline that surpassed the very tactics the guerrillas had created. They didn't declare their presence with loud helicopter engines or the boom of preparatory artillery. They emerged from the jungle seemingly without warning, delivered swift, deadly action, and then vanished before the local forces could organize a response. He recalled being told by his superiors that Americans could be fought or avoided depending on the situation. But if Australians were sighted, the only correct course was immediate withdrawal. Do not engage, the directive said. Do not attempt to test them. Another veteran, a former platoon leader named Tran Men, who had spent 6 years fighting in Phuoc Tuy province, described his encounters in an interview from 2003. He explained that he had fought Americans countless times, clashing with them in large battles where noise, movement, and confusion filled the air. He survived some of those engagements, lost comrades in others, but always felt he had a chance. He saw the Australians only twice, and both encounters left a lasting chill. The first time he escaped because instinct told him to run. The second time, 3 of his men hesitated and paid for it with their lives. He believed the Australians fought with a sense of discipline that felt almost unnatural. Yet he also spoke of them with respect, explaining that they were soldiers in the purest, most unyielding sense of the word. Captured Viet Cong documents help paint the same picture. A directive from October 1967 warned all unit commanders operating in Phuoc Tuy province that Australian forces represented the single greatest threat to their operations. Their reconnaissance skills were described as unmatched, their ambush tactics labeled as brutally effective, and the casualties they inflicted recorded as significantly higher than those caused by American forces, despite the Australians having far fewer troops in the theater. The document insisted that every unit increase vigilance, rotate sentries more frequently, avoid falling into predictable patterns, and act under the assumption that any movement might already be observed. Statistics from the war lend hard numbers to this fear. Between 1966 and 1971, the SAS launched over 1,200 patrols in Phuoc Tuy province alone. Their actions resulted in an estimated 492 enemy killed and more than 100 captured. During that same period, they suffered only 3 fatalities. The kill ratio, an astonishing 164-1, was something no American unit ever achieved. For comparison, the average American combat ratio hovered around 2-1, while even their elite SEALs and Green Berets rarely exceeded a ratio of 10-1. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't fully explain the psychological impact of an enemy that couldn't be anticipated. The Viet Cong were used to being the invisible ones, the ambushers, the unseen stalkers who waited patiently in the foliage for the perfect moment to strike. They were accustomed to choosing the time and place of conflict. But against the Australians, that dynamic collapsed. Suddenly, the Viet Cong weren't the hunters. They were the hunted. They walked through the jungle, unsure whether unseen eyes followed them. They approached trails convinced that a silent rifle might be pointed at them from some hidden vantage. A new phrase began circulating among Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tuy province, Marang, meaning jungle phantoms. These weren't soldiers in their eyes, but something otherworldly, something that could move without sound and kill without warning. The truth behind the legend, however, was far more grounded. In 2012, a former SAS patrol commander shared his own perspective. He said, "The myth of superhuman Australian soldiers wasn't accurate. They weren't fearless," he explained. "They were afraid most of the time. When 4 men moved deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by hundreds of opposing fighters, fear was natural, even necessary. But they were trained to convert that fear into heightened awareness rather than panic. Fear sharpened their senses, reminded them that survival depended on flawless discipline. What made them effective wasn't invincibility, but patience. The ability to lie completely still for hours, when the slightest twitch could expose them. The discipline to wait even when every instinct screamed to flee. These men lived and fought in conditions that stretched human endurance nearly to the breaking point. Leeches clung to their skin in clusters, tropical infections burrowed into open wounds, their bodies burned with dehydration and exhaustion. For some, the worst moments came not from gunfire, but from the jungle itself. One veteran recounted spending 14 straight hours motionless in an ambush position, while columns of driver ants crawled over him, biting repeatedly, leaving welts he would later count. 112 in total. But he didn't dare brush them away. Enemy fighters were only 30 meters away, and one movement could have doomed the entire patrol. Not every mission went smoothly. On one occasion, a patrol accidentally triggered a booby trap. The resulting explosion didn't kill anyone, but it alerted a nearby Viet Cong group to their presence. Within minutes, around 40 Viet Cong soldiers were racing toward the noise, forcing the 4 SAS men to retreat through the forest in a dead sprint toward a predetermined extraction point 6 kilometers away. They ran through mud, vines, and steep terrain, wounded and exhausted, their bodies pushed to their absolute limit. When the helicopter finally arrived to lift them out, the pilot reported seeing no pursuers in sight. But 30 seconds after the Australians were airborne, the Viet Cong arrived at the clearing. Half a minute was the difference between life and death. These men weren't larger-than-life heroes from an action film. They were disciplined professionals who understood that every mission demanded total commitment. One mistake didn't just mean personal risk. It meant the possible death of every man in the patrol. And that knowledge shaped them into some of the most effective jungle fighters the world had ever seen. Out there in the dense green corridors of Vietnam, survival depended on more than courage, and it demanded a level of discipline that bordered on obsession. The men of the SAS checked every piece of gear until they could do it blindfolded, repeated drills until their muscles responded faster than thought, and trained their bodies to keep moving, even when sleep became a luxury they rarely tasted. At times, they pushed through 3 days with barely a couple of hours of rest, yet still remained sharp enough to detect a snapped twig or the faint shift of air that signaled danger. 4 men operating deep in hostile territory needed more than skill. They needed an unshakable trust that each man would stand firm when the darkness pressed in. That trust, built under the weight of constant risk, stayed with them long after Vietnam faded from their maps. By 1971, Australia began withdrawing its forces from the conflict. The war would grind on for 4 more years, but the quiet footfalls of the SAS no longer echoed through the thick undergrowth. What they left behind, however, endured long after the last patrol returned home. Military units across the world studied the methods these Australians had perfected. Small teams moving with absolute silence, gathering intelligence with meticulous patience, striking only when success was certain, and disappearing before reinforcements could react. These strategies, polished in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, became foundational lessons for modern special operations forces everywhere. The men who served rarely speak loudly of what they endured. When they do share glimpses of those years, Their words carry no hint of bragging. They simply describe doing what their training demanded, leaning on skill and instinct to survive moments that could have ended their lives in an instant. And they never fail to remember the 3 soldiers who didn't return, because in their eyes, every patrol was a shared burden, every risk carried equally, every loss personal. Today, the trails they once walked are swallowed by vines, the old camps reduced to fragments, and the jungle has reclaimed what war once scarred. Yet the memories remain alive in those who fought on both sides. Vietnamese veterans, even decades later, speak of the Australians with a sober kind of respect. They acknowledge the conflict, the battles won and lost, the harsh necessity of war, but also the professionalism of the men they faced. They say the Australians fought fiercely but never wastefully. They struck only when needed, took no pleasure in unnecessary bloodshed, and completed their missions with the smallest price in human life. To them, that restraint marked the difference between ordinary fighters and true soldiers. Fear was real because the Australians could not be heard, could seldom be seen, and could almost never be ambushed. But respect was just as real, because every encounter left the impression of opponents who fought not with recklessness, but with purpose and precision. If one must face an enemy, they believed, then let that enemy be one of honor. And in the deep shadows of Vietnam's jungles, the Australians became exactly that. In time, the stories grew into something larger than memory. They became legends whispered along old footpaths, stories of silent shapes that moved between trees, appearing without warning and slipping away without leaving tracks. Stories of an enemy who felt unreal, intangible, yet devastatingly effective. They became known by a name spoken with caution: Marang, the phantoms who drifted through the forest unseen, who struck with chilling accuracy, who belonged to the jungle as much as the shadows did. And so the legend endures, long after the gunfire faded. The Australians, ordinary men who mastered extraordinary demands, became the ghosts the Viet Cong feared most, the unseen hunters of Vietnam, the phantoms of the jungle.